So your question is, in what situations would I say that
Yeah, because you
financial support is
say,
not
yeah, I'll
an
restate it.
obligation?
I'll restate it. So if these circumstances are conditional, every condition is going to have a different prescription that you would give. Let's start with the prescription you would give when you think it is okay to leave a woman destitute.
Well, I don't know that I would say that it's ever okay to leave someone destitute. I'm sure there are
Regardless of what they
people,
do?
you know, I can only speak for myself, but that's not in my nature. That's not something I would ever do to somebody. Um, Even if they had treated me really badly, I would still, just my own sense of integrity wouldn't allow me to do that. I understand though that, everybody's different. Everybody processes that kind of thing different. Not everybody is such a forgiving person. And, maybe sometimes that forgiveness isn't even warranted.
Well, then I don't
So,
understand. Actually, I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut you off. And by the way,
no,
if
go
I'm
ahead.
cutting in too much, you can tell me. But just for the purpose of like moving the conversation along, I don't understand how it's not a universal claim from you. Then how can it not be universal if at the same time you're saying, you would never do it? Are you just saying I would never do it? So from my own preference, that's not okay, but it's not universal. Or what do we mean by this here?
I wouldn't say it's universal. Not everybody has the same personal equation. Um, and the types of people I would get into relationships with are going to be different than the types of people somebody else might get into a relationship with. I don't find myself getting into relationships with people that would really ever come up. So, as to like the universality of it, that was never my position to begin with. That is what everybody else who had kind of attacked me for it interpreted as, despite my repeated protestations to the contrary. Um, so, I mean, I wouldn't say that there's no circumstance in which one should not just up and leave. I mean,
Well, what
if
are
somebody
those
cheats on you and
circumstances?
betrays you, I mean, I can't really say that, oh, well, this person completely betrayed you. You need to still like support them financially. I mean, I could totally understand why somebody wouldn't want to do that.
So
And
then,
I don't,
so would that be okay? Would you, from your view, are you still holding your integrity and are you still holding to your morality? If you walk in and your sister's banging your brother and you just turn around and, I mean, I'm sorry, not your sister, your wife is banging your brother or something, and
I
you
don't
just
come
turn
from
around
that
and
kind
walk
of
out.
family.
Yeah, yeah. But you just turn around and walk out, right? You turn around and walk
Right.
out, and you're like, I've had it, right? And you take all of your stuff and you leave. Is the man doing something wrong there?
No, I wouldn't say that it's wrong.
Okay.
Like I would say he'd
So
be well
then
within his
what?
rights to do that.
So then actually, what we have established is it's your view that for you personally, you wouldn't do it, but as far as the universal claims go, that men should never leave their women destitute. That's actually not true. There's many cases where if a man leaves his woman destitute, you would actually agree with that. Is that right?
I hate to say agree because part of me is kind of like I just there's just something about it that doesn't feel right. But
Well, then is
I
the claim
also
universal?
yeah, no, it's not a universal claim. It never was a
So then
universal
there must be
claim.
some. There must be like some agreement there somewhere, right?
I could understand why someone would do that, and I would not really be able to condemn them for it, even though it may not be a choice that I personally would make for myself.
So then it's not immoral for them to do it, and you wouldn't actually have a. Well, I mean, how could you? What would the disagreement there be then? Just, just ick. Like it just kind of gives you the ick. Is that the totality of the disagreement?
I wouldn't characterize it as the ick. I just don't like to see people have suffering inflicted on them. But at the same time, I'm like, well, actions have consequences, and
Yeah.
if you want to go and like bang your husband's brother and he catches you, like, can you really blame him for just slamming the door and walking out?
Yeah.
I like to think that people could be adult about these things and still come back and say, like, yeah, obviously we can't still be in a relationship together, but can we just be mature and amicable about the division of assets and so on and so forth?
Well, maybe we can take it
I
one
know a
step
lot of people
further,
can't do that.
and I'll ask you a different question. Is there instances in which leaving the woman completely destitute would likely actually be good for her?
Yeah, possibly.
So then
I
if
mean,
there's
some people do
cases
need to
and
hit rock bottom in
yeah.
order to
So
change.
then if we can agree that there's circumstances in which leaving them destitute would be good for them, then wouldn't the morally righteous thing to be to leave them more destitute?
Yeah, potentially if it's getting into a scenario where your support is going to enable them.
So then it sounds like we have no ought for why you shouldn't leave them destitute, but we do have at least some oughts for why you should.
Fair enough.
Those
Okay.
that's the case, I think you got to revamp your position and say that there's cases where men ought to leave their women destitute, which would be the inverse of what the debate prompt is, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay. Well, I will happily take that
Um,
as a concession on part 1, and we can move into part 2 if you'd like.
I mean, I don't know that I would say like he ought to do this. I don't, as a general rule, I'm not big on telling people what they should or should not do. I'm
What do you mean?
I'm big
Yeah,
on
you're-
guiding principles. Make your decision according to those guiding principles. But when it comes to like what actions are you going to take, I'm if somebody
it's
comes
a
and asks me for
theory-
advice, should
Yeah.
I leave my wife destitute? I mean, well, what are the circumstances? I'm even if he lays out a really good case as to why he should leave her destitute, I would still come back and say, well, I can't really tell you what to do. You have to make that decision for yourself. I'm not going to put my stamp of approval on it, is what I'm saying, one way or the other.
Yeah, but why not? Like if you would think that this was a good thing, it'd be the same thing. Like I could give you examples, perhaps, of a child who is inside the house. They're a grown child, right? They're like 16, 17, and they often steal from their parents or something like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
By having the child there, continuing to allow them to steal, you are actually enabling that behavior, right?
Yes, you would be.
Yeah, you'd be enabling it. So I would see it as a moral ought to say, well, I think it'd probably be a good idea for you to stop allowing them at 18, 19, 20 years old when they're adults to continue to come into your home and victimize you. And it's through that exercise of boundaries that they perhaps will learn their lesson that they're not allowed to do this because of the enablement. I can make the same case on women who are promiscuous or perhaps routine cheaters, that absent the consequence of them actually having serious repercussions for the behavior, they have no incentive to change that behavior. You could even make the case with men if this is the case, right? If that's so, and I think we'd have to agree that it is, how could you actually say we ought not do that in those circumstances? Because it seems to be like we ought do that in those circumstances.
In
right?
some extreme circumstances, maybe. Like if the person that's asking for some financial support is a drug addict or something, and you know
Sure.
that all the money you give them is just going to be poured into their drug habit, that's inevitably going to lead them down a terrible, terrible path.
So if you had a junkie wife, leave her destitute.
Yeah, like in a case like that. But again, these are extreme cases where the answers are a little bit easier, and most people's relationships are not. I think most breakups exist more in a gray area.
Look, I agree. I'm going to give you all the olive branch I possibly can. I tend to agree with you that these are more the edge cases than the commons, though I don't think that the blindsiding the men with divorce is an edge case. I think that that's actually fairly common. But that aside, leaving that aside, when it comes to the idea of I believe that men should support women they're no longer with, and then the qualifier is, well, based on conditionals. If I can give you sufficient conditionals in which it would actually behoove the woman to be left destitute, then that seems like it would cripple this entire position, because you would be saying then, no, there's circumstances where you actually ought to do that, and that is the most moral thing to do, right?
In some extreme circumstances, yes.
Yeah. So then I don't think we even need to go any further with that. The case in the proposition of should men leave their women destitute, the conclusion is to this, sometimes, right? Sometimes, at least.
Maybe sometimes, but
Sometimes.
I would say not in the majority of cases. And
I'm actually even willing to engage with that. I'm actually even willing to engage with whether or not it should be done in the majority of cases. So If it is the case that everything is done from you through the prism of perspective ethics, or the ethical purview of, I'm guessing, what you think is what is moral or what ought be done, is that the case? There's no universals you ascribe to?
I mean, I do subscribe to certain moral universals, just not necessarily in a case like this.
Not stance independent ones, though?
Sorry, say that again?
They're not stance independent? Like, you're not basing them on anything other than your own personal stance?
A lot of it is based on my personal stance, sure.
Yeah. So
a lot of my position on this is based on my perspective of the world, how I would handle things, how I have handled things, the expectations I've had of partners that I've broken up with, and so forth. And I realize that most people don't engage on that level. I realize that a lot of breakups are really nasty, and that a lot of people don't have the emotional maturity to split in an amicable way, even in the face of like some kind of a betrayal or something like that. So I recognize that on the one hand, the standards that I have in my own life are maybe not applicable to everybody, or even reasonable for everybody. And
I'm actually willing to just engage as is with the stance. Okay. And instead of trying to beat you up on whether or not I think the meta-ethical or metaphysics or anything is consistent, that can be a very boring debate. I'm actually just kind of willing to grant the stance for the purpose of the argument. So if it is the stance that most of what you would consider an ought or things like this, or most of what you consider to be moral, is not stance independent, but basically comes from you, my guess, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you're looking for kind of the best social outcomes for people, right?
You can put it that way.
Well, that makes sense to me, right? I think that in almost every ethical system, it's really hard to get away from the fact that we're still trying to look for good social outcomes, and all these ethical systems are driving kind of towards that in their own way, right? Would you kind of grant that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to make a different argument now based on the majority claim, the claim that the majority shouldn't. I would actually believe that socially, the outcomes for society over the long term would be better if more people left the opposition destitute and they had to deal with the consequences of the failed relationship without the aid of the state and without the aid of court enforcement, which would then provide aid. They'd actually have to work their problems out and things like this. And I actually would argue that that would probably be better for society, ultimately.
Yeah, I'd actually agree with that. I'm not a big fan of the court system. I think a lot of the pushback I got on this was from, men who kind of perceived me as advocating for, what they kind of call divorce rate or something, which isn't the case at all. Like, I'm not... I'm very anti-state in that regard. And I think if there was not the ability to just kind of take your problems before a judge and get greedy lawyers involved and everything, like,
you would have to actually deal with the problems, right?
Yeah.
So then now it seems like we have actually an ought against even the majoritarian claim of destitute. Like, most relationships, you shouldn't leave the other person destitute. Isn't it actually true that if in the majority of the cases people were left destitute and the aid of the state wasn't coming in to kind of push that person up, that they would actually have to deal with these problems alone without that social safety net? They would probably actually have to start working those problems out. Wouldn't that actually be a really good counterclaim against the claim of even the majority here?
I don't know that it's necessarily a counterclaim, because it kind of implies that I was suggesting that people use the state to achieve these ends, which is not a claim that I ever made.
No. Hang on. Let me qualify.
Go ahead.
I don't believe that you ever made such a claim, but I do believe that that would be an entailment of the claim. So I think that it is an entailment of the claim when you're talking about leaving them destitute and why you ought not do that. That if I'm saying, well, socially, I think that the ramifications of doing that would lead to better social outcomes, and you say, well, I tend to agree because of the court system and things like this, then that would be an entailment of that position, right?
I suppose you can characterize it that way.
Yeah. So, I mean, if that's the case, then I think I've made a really good argument for why even in the majority of cases, I wouldn't even grant that you shouldn't leave them destitute in the majority of them. So on the conditional cases, we've now agreed. And now in the majority of cases, I think we've even found some at least common ground. I know you don't fully agree, perhaps, but I think that I've made a more compelling argument here against that claim than you've made for the claim.